I have a tendency of forgetting that. So basically just walking through what Ally is, what it's going to look like inside of D2L, what are some of the ways you can use it to improve the accessibility in your courses, and then obviously we'll have some demos. I have it set up in my spring course so we can see what it actually looks like instead of just looking at screenshots. And then we'll obviously have some time for question and answer. So if you have any questions as we roll along, feel free to go ahead and type those in the chat window. I've got a couple people helping me out here today to answer those. I'll try to keep my eye on that as best as I can, though. So let's roll right into things here. So just a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll do an implementation overview of what kind of things we're going to be doing with Blackboard Ally, when it's going to happen, and so forth. I'll give you a brief introduction about what Blackboard Ally is. I think a number of you are familiar with Ally to some extent. Some of you may have not have heard of it at all. So hopefully we'll be able to get everybody on the same page here today. And then we'll talk about the three main things that Ally does for us in terms of providing alternative formats for our course documents, the instructor feedback tools and the guidance that it provides to us to make our content more accessible, and then kind of the 50,000-foot view of how we can look at accessibility in our courses and kind of address it from there. So I just want to set some expectations before we move forward with the rest of this training. So again, as I shared earlier, what this training will be is basically an overview of Blackboard Ally and a how-to guide for using the tools inside of D2L. What it's not going to be is an exhaustive or extensive overview on content remediation. In other words, we're not going to tell you how to fix and tag PDFs and things like that. We do have a number of other resources set up for that. I've got the link in the slides here as well to our digital accessibility training. Angela's done a wonderful job of setting up a number of resources and self-assessment tools that you can use to walk through very common remediation issues that we find in our course content, primarily PDFs. We're going to pick on PDF a lot today, so just be prepared for that because that's the most common issue. So we talk about how we can go through those steps of fixing those common issues there as well. One of the nice things about Ally, though, is it does give us some of that as well. So, but it only goes so far. And so the digital accessibility training shell really is a deeper dive into that. And then, of course, if you do run into issues or have any questions or comments after today's session or as you're dealing with content and accessibility in your courses, feel free to reach out to the CTL there, and our email address is there. Again, I have, for those of you that are joining in late here, I did put a link in the chat window for the slides. We will also be keeping tabs of who's in here, and then we will send that out afterwards as well so that you can have these as a reference so you don't have to take fast and furious notes here. So some basic implementation information. As you've probably seen in the all faculty email, our go live date is January 4th. We've actually had Ally installed for a number of months now, and it's already processed the content in our courses. So now it's just a matter of when we flip the switch so that you guys can actually see those reports, see those tools and things like that. And we picked January 4th just because it allows us to get through the end of the semester because we're all kind of grinding through things. Just, you know, just the normal semester is usually a grind at this point, but getting through it in COVID-19 too, so we want to be cognizant of that. That gives us a week to kind of process those things so you can at least get a general idea of where there might be some issues in your course and address some of those before students have access to those. And we'll show you what students will see on that perspective as well. We don't have any real formal plan on checking accessibility and dealing with that through the reporting mechanisms that we have. We're just going to kind of let things grow organically this semester. Make it available. Hopefully people will kind of jump in and start addressing those issues, especially the ones that are easy to fix. And I'll show you those here in a little bit. And then just kind of take a measure afterwards, probably about midway through the semester to see where we're at. We've got kind of a benchmark already of where the courses are at without any kind of remediation, without any kind of resources that Ally provides. And then we'll kind of see what it looks like afterwards. And that will give us some guidance as to how will we step forward. What are we going to look at in terms of future content remediation? What are our strategic goals for making our courses accessible? And the nice thing, eventually, we're still working with some of the reporting details for the institutional level here. That's why I'm not going to cover that much today. But we can take a look at, is there a department that's having a specific issue that's very common in their courses? Well, let's actually go to them and start doing specific training on that. Maybe it's in chemistry and they're using a lot of images for their chemical equations, whereas we want them to start using MathML or things like that. So we tend to pick on the STEM courses because they tend to have the most challenges with respect to accessibility, but we'll talk about some really common issues that really span subject matter areas. And so, yeah, and then later this spring, we don't have a definitive date yet. Maybe Angela has thought a little bit about this. She's really driving the process here for USD. I'm more involved at the system level, so I'm not involved in the specific plans and rollouts for the institutions. But later in spring, sometime around midterm, spring break, so forth, we'll take a look at where we're at and to see what's been going well. Maybe where some areas that we can troubleshoot a little bit further, and then kind of move forward from there. So what kind of impact is this going to have to you and your students? What are they going to see inside of D2L? Well, I took some screenshots of what this looks like in my own course, and hopefully you can see it's actually fairly subtle. So when a student logs into your course, goes into the content area of the course, really the only change that they're going to see is this little icon to access alternative formats in the course. And we'll take a look at what that means here in a little bit. But that subtle little icon is really all the students are going to see with respect to Blackboard Ally in the course. When they click on that, they do see a little bit of different interface, and I'll show you that here in a little bit as well. For you as instructors, again, there's not much more. You see this little gauge icon here, and that's simply telling you how Ally has scored your content versus a number of different accessibility standards, WCAG 2.1 level AA. And when you click on that, it will give you a lot of details. Why did this particular piece of content score low? Well, this was an example bad document that I threw into my course just so I can see what kind of report it would generate. And the nice thing about it is it will kind of tell us how to fix those things as well. So I'll take you through that process as well. Short of that, that's really all that's changing in D2L with respect to the Blackboard Ally integration. We do add a link to the nav bar that will be available on January 4th, so you can access your course report. I'll get into that in a little bit. But really, that's all that's going to be changing in D2L with respect to what kind of impact Ally is going to have. So as you see, you look through your content, you're just going to see a couple new icons. Again, you'll notice that students don't actually see this accessibility gauge. So they won't know, oh, hey, Professor Mostard's got some really bad content in here because it's not scoring well. They don't see that particular report, but we do as instructors, we do as the institution as well. So that's just kind of a little visual indicator for you to see, okay, well, this document has some issues, so maybe I'll click on that and figure out what those issues are. Maybe those are things I can resolve on my own. Maybe that's something I need to engage the CTL with, or maybe I need to drop into the digital accessibility training course and figure out, okay, how do I tag a PDF? How do I set up headers in a Word document so that that's not going to be a problem? And that's one of the issues with this particular document. Other than that, that's really the only visual change that we'll see. I'll go into some of the specific interfaces and things like that so you can see how those work, but that's really pretty much it. But it's how we use these tools are going to have the big impact. If I can advance my slides. Okay, so we know what Ally looks like a little bit now. We have a rudimentary understanding of what Ally is. Let's dig into that in a little bit more detail. So what Blackboard Ally does is automatically gauges the accessibility of your content based on WCAG 2.1 level AA standards. You don't need to know what those are. That's for us instructional designers to worry about, which is really nice because one of the things it really tries to do is not obfuscate the language. It really tries to describe, okay, here's the issue with the document, here's why it's an issue, without getting into the technical jargon or detail that we don't want faculty to have to worry about. But it is going to give you that guidance to say, hey, you've got images in your Word document that don't have alternate tags. Why is this a problem? Well, if a student is using a screen reader, they have no idea what is in that image if there isn't a description for that image. And so it'll take you through the rationale behind why that was scored low, and then more importantly, give you some guidance on how to fix that. So the other really nice thing that Ally does is it automatically creates alternative versions of course files. And I found this really fascinating. It's an area that I hadn't expected Ally to deal with, but what it can do, for example, is take that Word document that I had posted as a screenshot earlier, and it converts it into a PDF. It converts it into an HTML file, an EPUB document for e-readers. I could even do a text-to-speech on it. And so these are really great ways for students to consume that information in a format that makes the most sense to them. It's not going to just really dictate that the student can only access that document as a Word document. So what's really nice is if you've gone through our online teaching and training aspects or processes at all for the past 5 or 10 years, we've probably told you, well, not always every student has access to Word, so it's probably best to use a PDF. Well, here's a tool now that lets them download a PDF of any document that's in your course. So you don't even have to worry about that anymore, which is really nice for me as an instructor. I can just worry about one format. I can maintain it that way. I don't have to worry about, okay, well, I made a change to that Word document, so now I got to upload a different version of that and so forth. Students can now choose that, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. it's one of the reasons why we recommend using the cloud-based tools, but now Blackboard Ally takes care of that for you. And it's really not even a traditional accessibility issue. It's just kind of a convenience factor. But there are some students that like to hear things. There are some students that like to consume the content in a different way. Maybe I have an e-reader that I want to load up my entire course content on. I can do that. What benefit does an e-reader have versus what's inside a D2L as a PDF or a Word document? Well, I can make highlights. I can synchronize those changes across my devices. I can have it read back to me. I can change the font size. I can take notes, and all of that's captured on my ebook or my e-reader. And I don't have to worry about having a physical copy on my desktop somewhere like that. So it provides a lot of conveniences and really kind of taps into that multimodal learning. I'll get into that in just a second, Diana. The short answer is that it does not. So we will get there in a minute, though. So what else does it do? It also provides a lot of reporting and a lot of dashboards, useful information to us in a very easy to consume way to see how are our courses doing. We can look at that from the instructor level. How are our courses doing from an institutional level? So we can kind of see all of that and what it looks like from there. So why do we want to have Blackboard Ally? What benefits does that provide to the institution? Well, if you look at it from a traditional accessibility perspective and how we used to handle accessibility, it certainly helps us with our accommodation process. It certainly helps us with our compliance perspective. This is, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights are looking for tools like this for institutions to adopt to make sure that, hey, we've got these things going on. We're taking proactive steps to make sure our content is accessible. And it really helps us with kind of our one-to-one type of one-off accommodation. So I have a student that needs this document to be done via Braille. So this is going to help us out with that. But if you've been involved with the CTL for the last few years, we're trying to take a step forward, a move away from just the accessibility accommodation model and moving to a model where we're trying to design our courses to be accessible for all from the beginning. Now, that's really hard to do as a faculty member because you're subject matter experts. We don't want you to be bludgeoned and overwhelmed by all the different accessibility standards. So we've been kind of at a standstill for this for quite a while. We've been able to do some UDL types of things, Universal Design for Learning, building content in ways that can be consumed by various different audiences, and adding just kind of one other extra level of accessibility to our content. But again, it's really hard without a good tool set to do that. And that's what Blackboard Ally does. And it'll make a little bit more sense when I look at the next slide. When we look at our typical 21st century learners, and this model probably needs to be updated a little bit in light of COVID-19, but when we think about accessibility, we tend to focus right here on this very first one, people that have what we call the visual disability or visible disability, someone that's handicapped, someone that's blind, someone that's deaf. These are things that are pretty easy for us to identify. When there's a whole host of students that are taking our courses that need accommodations for various different reasons, and not all of them are traditionally associated with a disability. We have non-traditional students that need to consume information in different ways that makes more sense to them. I think of one of the great things I like about using Zoom is that Zoom allows students to be able to download our videos. And I had a student last semester tell me, I love that feature because I commute to work an hour and a half every day. And so what I can do is I can throw up your lectures on my phone, download them as MP3s, throw them on my phone, and I can listen to them on the way there. I mean, that's not something that we were thinking about necessarily 10 years ago, making our content available in that fashion. Well, now Ally, as I shared with you, can do that on the individual content level. So not just my lectures, there's any resource inside the course that the students want to download as an audio file, basically an audiobook, they can do that. Think of posting a journal article that's 40 pages long. The student have to kind of sit there, carve out 40 minutes and do that. But hey, if I'm commuting, I can download an audio version of that journal article and listen to it as I'm driving to work. That's just a whole new way of consuming that information. And it really helps out those students when there's kind of dead time, when they're not doing anything else while they're commuting. So they don't have to carve out additional time to do that when they're dealing with family, when they're dealing with events and things like that. International students, it's one of the areas that we haven't enabled yet in Ally, but I'll get into this in a little bit. But one of the things it can do is provide machine translations for any document in the course in about, I think, 24 languages. Right now, it's kind of you turn it on for everybody and then just figure out who we don't want to turn it on for. So you can imagine, for example, I think I saw Carol Leiberger jump in here. Carol, I don't know if you're teaching German courses anywhere, but Carol Leiberger was my German teacher. Now you can imagine we probably won't want to turn machine translations on for a German course, right? Because, Yeah, so I want the students to learn Goethe's Faust on their own and not have to have it translated for them. So those are kind of things that we have to think about. So we decided, because we're letting this go or grow organically, we'll leave that off for now. But just know that if that's something that you want enabled for your course, we can enable that on an individual basis. And then as we kind of see how this goes, that will be something that we'll probably enable later on, and just kind of get a list of departments that probably don't want to have that turned on, like the Spanish department and things like that. So we'll kind of work through some of those things. What other ones I want to talk about here? Mobile. I already talked about being able to download content as an MP3 to listen to it anytime, anywhere. It's a really great function of Blackboard Ally. But it also formats that content automatically to work on mobile devices. I don't know how many of you have smartphones. I'm going to guess many of you do. Have you ever tried to access a Word document on a smartphone? What kind of experience is that? Not very good. Accessing a PDF on a smartphone, not really good either. I have to kind of zoom in, have to scroll all around with my hands to see that. Well, one of the things, as I shared with you, is that Blackboard Ally automatically converts content in your course to an EPUB format, which is the most common format for ebooks and e-readers. And one of the great advantages of that is that creates flowable content. So I can change the font size. It's going to automatically adapt to my screen size. I can change the contrast, background, one color, foreground, a different color. I have a lot of control of how I see that. So not only is that really good for mobile devices, that's good as an accessibility measure as well. Maybe I have difficulties discerning things that are contrasting, that's not far enough separated. Well, I see a lot of instructors like to put red and green text inside of their Word documents, which is kind of a no-no, and that's something that Ally is going to talk about. But if I bring that into an EPUB format, I have control over that. I can change that font size to make it bigger so that contrast ratio is better. I can change the color. I can do all kinds of things here. So again, it's empowering me to consume the information in the course in a way that makes the most sense for me. And so that's one of the real powerful things about Blackboard Ally. And so a lot of this goes to this other area here about invisible disabilities, things that we're not always necessarily aware of. And especially now, as we move more into the accessibility by design, there's an expectation, and kind of where we're at legally is that students don't have to disclose whether they have a disability. So the expectation from the Office of Civil Rights and the expectation from the Department of Justice is that your content should be accessible by design. They shouldn't have to request accommodation to get access to that information. And so Ally is going to help with that, but Ally also helps with those disabilities that aren't as necessarily obvious to us. One of the great things I'll talk about here that Ally provides is what they call their BeeLine Reader. And what's interesting is that this was originally introduced as a tool to help people learn how to speed read, how to synthesize information more quickly. But what they've found is that students with dyslexia, students with ADHD actually find the tool very, very useful and more helpful for them to synthesize the information than just reading the text on a black and white screen or so forth. And I'll show you what that looks like. And they've got a lot of feedback from people with dyslexia that's very useful to them. And so they decided to incorporate, they actually were going to put that in the Blackboard Learn, which is the equivalent of Desire to Learn. That's their LMS. But they decided to bring it into Blackboard Ally because they were hearing so much feedback from students with dyslexia and other learning disorders that it was very helpful to them. And so I'll show you that here in a little bit. So this is really why I'm spending a lot of time on that kind of alternative formats, because the great thing about this is, as an instructor, I don't have to worry about this. Ally does this automatically for me. As an instructor, probably what I'll need to do is just make my students aware of this, and we're going to have a campaign for students as well to tell them about this. But this is going to be available for every course, for every piece of supported content in those courses. And so it's going to be a really great resource for students. One of the other concepts that we tend to think about, when we focus on making our content accessible, again, we tend to focus on the students with disabilities. The student's blind, the student is hard of hearing. And so we need to make our content accessible to them in that fashion. And we tend to think that that only is going to benefit those students. But making our course content accessible has benefits to students without traditional disabilities as well. For example, I know I've seen this in courses before. As we're going through and doing our QA reviews, we have a scanned book chapter, and it often looks like this. Now, for me as a normal sighted person without a disability, yeah, it's a little bit fuzzy, but I can still read it. It does slow me down though. I mean, I'm not gonna be as efficient reading through this because, as I read through this text, if you look at the text on the left from the PowerPoint slides or from the Google slides, it's much more crisp, much more clear than what you see in that scanned document here. So that's a problem. But I can use it. It's not the greatest experience. But if I have a visual impairment, I'm not going to be able to read that very well at all. And so I'm going to have that read back to me. Well, if a PDF is scanned like this in the course, and I bring that up in my reader, it has nothing. It has no idea what's going on here. This is an image. It's not going to be able to discern any content from that. And so here we have a student that can't access a required reading, and that's going to be a big problem. So typically what we've done is we've asked instructors to OCR those documents, and then they'll come back to us like, what does OCR mean? And OCR means optical character recognition. So basically what we're doing is we're using machine learning computer programs to go through and try to parse out the individual pieces of text from this image and present it in a fashion that's more legible and more readable to students. So that's a very laborious process. So I've got 3 chapters I need to do. I throw it in there, it spits it back out at me. Early OCR programs weren't very good. It's basically just looking for the characters and just translating them that way. It was not context aware. So it's not saying, okay, well, this word probably is going to be this, as opposed to, well, this looks like this, even though it may not make any sense in that context. This is what I think it looks like, and goes through that. And then it introduces, inaccuracies and problems and things that don't make any sense. Now, obviously, OCR has improved a great deal since then, but it's still kind of a hassle. Well, again, one of the nice things that Blackboard Ally does is it will automatically OCR these documents for us and present them in all of those formats that I've already talked about. It can OCR this PDF and convert it to an MP3. It OCRs it and converts it into an EPUB document. Now, is that a panacea? Is that going to fix everything? No, it's going to be only as good as the quality of the document. So if I have a really poorly scanned copy of something, even the greatest OCR software in the world is going to be able to make heads or tails of that. It struggles with tables, it struggles with graphs and things like that. Again, the context is something that's a little bit more difficult to ascertain from these types of things, but it's certainly a start. But what Ally is going to do is it's going to take that step and OCR that for you. So at least we have a minimally accessible document. But it is going to flag that and say, hey, there's some problems with this document. Perhaps we should go through and professionally do this through OCR, have someone read through it, make sure that we've done a good job of accurately transcribing that. Because one of the things about those alternative formats, it's great that it does all of those, but we don't have any control of the content once it's in there. So if it's done a really poor job of OCRing that, that's going to translate through all of those documents, and that can have some rather humorous results at times. So when you have text-to-speech going on an inaccurately OCR document, sometimes the results are really humorous. And so unfortunately, we can't control that. Again, this is all automated. So the only control that we have over that is going back to that source document, making sure it's accurate, and going from there and moving forward with that. And those are things that we have processes set up here at the institution to deal with. So I want to talk about some of the great things that Ally does, but be recognizing that it's not going to fix everything. It's not going to be perfect, and we'll kind of carry that on through to some of the other questions that have happened in the chat window here as well. So I've already talked a lot about these alternative formats, but let me dig into this a little bit more deeply here. So as I shared with you, Ally will automatically convert supported document formats into various different alternatives. This is actually what the screen looks like when you click on that. So if we go back to, I'll get it here in a second. All the way back here. There we go. So if I were a student, I'm going in and I'm looking at bad document, and I click on this alternative format icon. Give me a few seconds to get back to the slide here. There we go. This screen is going to pop up for me as a student. So I can download the original document as a Word document. I can download it as a tagged PDF, an HTML file, an EPUB, electronic braille, an audio MP3 file, or in that BeeLine Reader format here. And so it provides me a lot of different types of content in a lot of, well, the same type of content in a lot of different fashions rather. So I can look through here and know, okay, well, I have an e-reader, I have a Kindle, or I've got my e-reader on my phone, and I want to be able to read this on a mobile device. So the best formats for reading on mobile devices are going to be HTML or EPUB. I prefer EPUB because I can do a lot of different things with that. I can take notes, I can highlight, I can share, I can all do those different things. So obviously one of the things as we share this with students, we'll be talking about the different formats, what they mean and things like that. But again, it provides that automatically in those formats, which is really great. And again, in addition to aiding accessibility, fixing those bad PDF scans and trying to do that, even though again, it's not perfect, it's still something that we're going to want to address at the source document, not just rely upon Ally to do that. But again, it is providing a lot of that automatically for us. And that can help us with not just accessibility, but also, again, it helps facilitate multimodal learning and universal design, universal access. So again, let's take a look at that really quick. So I've showed you some screenshots here. Let's actually go into my course here. I'm gonna go to my content area of my course. And I'll get to this in just a minute here, but one of the things to note about this is that Ally is gonna check all of the content under content. So you'll notice here, I've got an admin area that students can't get into here. Ally is still going to check the content in there. So if I've not published something for my students, Ally is still going to take a look at that. So here I have a Jazz Games high score table. So you can see I've got a perfect accessibility score on them. But here's that bad document here. So even though it's a bad document, I'm a student, I want to download that. Again, I'm not going to see that as a student here. So I can click on that. And I've got all of these different options here. So say I want to download the EPUB version of that. And it's going to download an EPUB. I'll open it up and I'll share my book here. Let me stop sharing of this. So let me stop sharing that. I'll share my other screen here. So this is my ebook reader on my Mac here. So you haven't seen the source document of the Word document here, but it did a pretty good job of translating all of that into a format. So I can show you kind of some of the advantages here of doing this if it'll let me here. No, it's not gonna let me change the font size. Well, anyway, oh, there it is. So I can change the font sizes here. Maybe I want to read on black and white, or maybe I want a slightly less bright background there. I can change the font. There's certain fonts that helps, well, it's kind of mixed reviews on that. They're still determining the validity of the study, but supposedly there are fonts that are more useful for students that have dyslexia that helps them read a little bit. We're seeing some spurious data come out of that, but so I can kind of change the fonts, I can change the font size. So maybe I have a visual, maybe I'm not blind, but maybe I just like the font sizes a little bit bigger so I can read it a little bit easier. So again, not necessarily a disability per se, but it is impacting my learning experience. And so being able to change something to a more contrast ratio, higher contrast ratio, bigger font sizes, maybe a font that's a little bit easier to read. Maybe I don't like serif or sans serif fonts. Maybe I want a serif font. I can kind of go through that. I can highlight here. I can add notes. I can do all kinds of different things. That's not something I can do in a Word document very easily. I mean, I can do that, but this will translate to all of my devices that I'm using this e-reader with and so forth. So there's a lot of advantages that way. So again, not really even accessibility type of issue there that's resolving, but it's just making the content more accessible in the pure being able to access that document fashion here. So let me pop back into. So that's what that looks like. It's a pretty simple interface. I think the challenge for us is going to be telling students what all these, whoops, that disappear, stay there. Come here. And for some reason, my Safari just froze here. There it goes. I think the biggest challenge for us is just going to be informing students what these formats mean and what the best format is going to be for them if they decide to download an alternative format. So, but again, I posted this as a Word document. I can download that as a PDF. And then as the instructor, I haven't had to do anything about that. And it's just going to pop up in my PDF viewer, which is really great. So very, very simple thing there. So let me pop back into Ally slides here. Here's the BeeLine Reader. I didn't want to show a live demo of this because it doesn't really demonstrate a whole lot, and I don't know how useful it's going to be for everybody, but I just wanted to give you a look at what this does. Is it generates an HTML file that students can open up in any browser, including on mobile devices. And what it does is it uses highlighting and gradients to help students read through different text at different speeds. That's, again, it was originally developed to be a speed reading training tool, but again, there's some growing evidence that it's helpful for students with dyslexia, ADHD, vision impairments, and things like that. So that's what that looks like. So we're gonna have to dig into that a little bit more before we start promoting that, but it is a tool that's available for students as well. So let's talk about using Ally. Now we've talked about some of the automated things that Ally does for us. Well, let's talk about some of the things that we have to do in Ally to make our content more accessible. So there are a couple different workflows you can adopt using Ally. You can either kind of take the piecemeal approach where you've uploaded a piece of content, you see the accessibility score, hey, I'm going to fix that right away. Or you can kind of take a look at it from the overall course's accessibility, what I call the 50,000 foot view. You can see, generally how your course is doing, what's your overall course score, and what are things that you can address to make the greatest impact on that score. And that's done through the course report. I'll show that here in a little bit, but we're going to talk about that first workflow first, how we can look at individual pieces of content and address the accessibility issues there. So what Ally does is it has this instructor feedback area. And so if you recall from the screenshot earlier, where I clicked on the little alternative formats icon, for instructors, there's also an accessibility gauge for each piece of icon or each piece of content in the course there as well. And that's what you're going to click on to get into that feedback here. But before I get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about what Ally checks and what it doesn't check, because I've seen some chat questions about that here. And I'm going to make sure I pull my chat window up here again. And I'll get into I'll get into your question here in just a minute here. So what does Ally check? Well, Ally checks supported file formats linked to content area. So what does that mean? Well, what it's going to do is if you post a PowerPoint file, if you post a PDF or a Word document inside the content area of D2L, that's that area you access by clicking on content, that's what it's going to check. And so what file formats does it support? It supports PDF, Word, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, OpenOffice and LibreOffice, the same kind of files. So their version of their Office editor, their document editor, their presentation tool. Supports HTML files. I don't think many people upload HTML files, but if you do create content within D2L, it creates it as an HTML file too, and it does check those files created within D2L. It also checks all common image files, JPEG, GIF, PNG, BMP, and TIFF. So you might ask yourself, well, why is it checking images? Well, one of the things it checks specifically is animated GIFs, and to make sure that it is not causing strobing, which can cause epilepsy and other issues. And it actually did find one. I was kind of surprised it popped up. Like, why did it pop up with this animated GIF in this course? Well, when I looked at it on my Mac, it looked fine. But when I looked at it in a different browser, it was flashing really fast, and that could cause some eye strain issues. It could cause, epilepsy, things like that. Well, it doesn't cause epilepsy, because it can cause an epileptic issues and things like that. So it's actually checking for that, checking for frame rates of those images and things like that. As I noted earlier, it does this irrespective of the visibility to the students. So in other words, if I've got a content topic inside of D2L and I've got that hidden from students, Ally is still going to check in there, and that's still going to be part of my report. So one thing you might be asking yourself is like, well, I know I've gone through all the remediation of all the content that I published to my students, but I still have these files here that are still showing up as inaccessible. Well, check to make sure that they are not hidden in some area of your D2L content area. This is also a great opportunity to audit your content. I've seen, in my own course, when I was looking at this in my fall course, like, oh, there's some files that are scoring really poorly. It's like, well, I'm not really actually using those. And I went back and checked the reports, and students aren't really accessing those. So does it make sense for me to spend the time to fix those documents? If students aren't really using them, maybe I just make those files go away. And so that's one of the things I did as well. So it does this with existing and new content. So you're not aware of this, but any content you've been uploading in D2L since probably October, maybe November, maybe early November, has already been checked against Blackboard Ally's different accessibility checking. And so when we flip the switch, it's going to already have those scores available to you. But as you upload existing content too, it's going to be checking that. It takes, I think Angela said, it takes somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes. I'm going to guess at the start of the semester that's going to be a lot longer, just because we do have a finite amount of server resources. So as people are uploading thousands of documents to get ready for the start of the semester, don't expect to see the accessibility of those scores of those content documents right away. Now, if you do that during the semester, I'm going to guess it's going to be a lot quicker. But this is going to be our first full semester in Blackboard Ally, so we don't really have a good judge or good estimate of how long that's actually going to take to generate. So just be patient with that as you're going through that. So what's Ally not going to check? It's not going to check any files linked outside of the content area. So in other words, we have kind of two areas inside of D2L where we store files, or where we manage files, I should say. There's the content area where we actually link to the files, and there's that area that's called manage files, which is, if you think about it, it's just kind of a folder where you can dump all your files at. You don't have to necessarily link them on the content area. You know, I keep things in there that are not necessarily directly shared with students, but I like to have them in the course just as a resource for myself. Ally is not going to check those. So if it's not linked in the content area of the course, it's not going to be there. It's not going to check attachments in the discussion or Dropbox folders. So if you have a Dropbox folder assignment for students to fill out this form and submit it back to me, it's not going to check that form for accessibility. A really easy way around that, if you're concerned about that, is just create a hidden file, a hidden content area in your course, like I did for myself. I have that admin area, and just throw that document in there really quick, and it can check the accessibility score of that, fix that, and then you can, you know, upload that into your course as well. So that will be a way to check around that. It's not going to check any content outside of the content area. So if you have images and text and things like that you're putting into the widgets on the course homepage, not going to check any of that. If you link to a document from the course homepage, like many of us have our Getting Started widget on the D2L homepage, and there are links to the syllabus, the welcome letter, things like that, it's not going to check any of those. It's one of the reasons, well, this is now affirming our rationale for doing this, but one of the suggestions we have, instead of linking documents directly to the widgets, we advise you to first link them in the content area, and then provide your link from the Getting Started widget into the content area instead. The benefit that we've had for that previously is that then D2L's reporting tools track that. So if I have my syllabus link in my Getting Started widget, and I just link directly to the syllabus file in the Manage Files area, D2L is not going to report that. So if I click on that as a student, as an instructor, I can't be able to check that. Why would I want to know that? Well, if I have a student that comes to me and asks a question that's very obviously in the syllabus, the very first thing I do is check to see if that student has accessed the syllabus. And 9 times out of 10, that's not the case. So I'll just simply refer to them to the syllabus, say, hey, it looks like you haven't accessed the syllabus yet. Why don't you go do that? Now, if I link directly to the syllabus from the course homepage, again, D2L's reporting tools aren't going to track that for me to see. However, if I link my syllabus in the content area first, and then I make a link from the Getting Started widget to that content item, that does track that access. And so that ensures that whenever students are accessing that syllabus, I know what's happening. So again, when those questions come up, I can check to see if they've actually looked at the syllabus or the welcome letter or any other documents that link that way as well. Now, the benefit with Ally too is that because I've gone through that, that's my standard operating procedure for dealing with widget content, I'm already going to be able to take advantage of the Blackboard Ally reports as well on that content. So I don't have to do anything different. Images and exams, quizzes, discussions, again, none of that's going to be checked because it's not linked in the content area. This gets back to a couple of questions I saw earlier. It's not going to check any external content in the content area. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at my score here, I'm just going to give you a sneak preview of the Blackboard Ally course report. Now, it went down a little bit because I did purposely put in a bad document in my course, but without me doing much of anything, I have a 97% score for my Blackboard Ally accessibility score, which is really good. I mean, there's not much more to improve on that. But that's a bit of a misnomer. Why is that? Well, I actually don't have a lot of content in my course that's directly in the course. I link almost everything to Google Slides, Google Docs, Google Drive, and my own personal website where I have all my interactive examples and things like that. Ally is not going to check any of that. I know there are issues with those. I know my PowerPoints or my Google Slides don't have alt text for all the images. That's a big issue. It's a very simple issue to fix, but it's a big issue. So I know my course is not as accessible as it could be, but to Ally, it's like, hey, everything's great, good job. So again, it's not a panacea. It's not going to check any kind of that third-party linked content. So including like if you're using Google Drive, if you're using video links, the one exception there is if you embed YouTube videos inside of your course, it does check to see if that video has professional captions or human captions and doesn't rely upon the auto-generated captions. But in our conversations with Blackboard, they don't currently report that to instructors. They only report that to the institution. So, so we can't really see that yet. Another interesting thing, I've been working with the library on the impact of Ally with respect to the learning object repository, specifically with the electronic reserves. The The way we recommend instructors link to content via e-reserves is a link in there instead of copying the document for copyright reasons. That's what we want them to do. We don't want them to have a hard copy of that document. We want them to link to the item that's in the electronic reserves. That does not get checked. So if they inadvertently make a copy of that, that does get checked, because it will take a copy of that PDF that the library's put in the e-reserves, and it puts it in the course, and then it becomes part of the course content repository, and then it does get that checked against Blackboard Ally. So that's something that we're going to have to work with the library on to make sure that the content is accessible. So, what can we do with that? Well, what we might do is set up a course for the library to use and put the content in that course, have it checked for Ally, and then once it's made accessible, then we can link it to the learning object repository. So we're kind of working on that as well. Any kind of publisher or third-party content. So if you do deep links to any of the various different publisher resources like Pearson's MyLabs, McGraw-Hill Connect, Cengage, MindTap, or whatever they call it now, any of those links are not going to be checked by Blackboard Ally. So it's really up to the publishers. The onus is on them to make sure that their content is accessible. And that's a real challenge for us, because if a student comes to us and say, hey, this content isn't accessible, to them, it doesn't matter if it's Blackboard's or if it's Pearson's problem or it's the instructor's problem. It's just a problem with the course, and it needs to be addressed. And that's kind of how the DOJ and the OCR look at that as well. So we are trying to pressure the third-party tools and the third-party content providers to make their content accessible. I'd say publishers are finally on board with this. It's a little bit more difficult when we adopt third-party tools. So that's why it's part of our review process, has a certain rigor that they have to adhere to make sure that their content is accessible. So that's why, hey, as an instructor, I want to adopt this really cool third-party tool that enhances student discussions. Well, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, because we do have to go through not only the data integrity issues and protection and things like that, FERPA issues, but we do now have to check for accessibility as well. So that's probably more of a deep dive than that you were interested in. So I think I've got everybody's questions answered. The V, in terms of copyright, that's a good question. So that's why, if copyright is a concern, that's generally why we consider, especially for publisher materials and things like that, using the e-reserves instead of directly linking that content into the content area of your course. Other than that, I've talked to AJ a little bit about this. AJ Franken's our legal counsel. Generally publishers are okay if we're doing this for accessibility purposes. Now it's kind of overly broad now with all the alternative formats that Blackboard Ally provides. Now we're doing that from the perspective of making the course content more accessible. So it's kind of a legal gray area right now. So that's something that we continue to kind of monitor. Other questions. So the remaining sections of the Communications Decency Act will hold us responsible for the content we uploaded or linked to it. That again would be more of a legal question that we'd have to explore more, Michael, because there are some, again, it's kind of a gray area. We were doing this under the good faith effort to make our content more accessible to students. And so generally, copyright has accommodations for that. Specifically, the Teach Act has accommodations for that as well. Now, if it gets a little bit more dicey, because is it truly for accessibility or access, or what defines a disability? And we get into the legal discussion about that, and so that's a little bit more of a fuzzier gray area there as well. Karen, I don't understand what your question. Could you please elaborate on that? So Zoom with Ally. Are you asking if Ally checks Zoom links or Zoom recordings for accessibility? And it will not. So if you provide a link to it, it's not going to do that. But there are also some other accessibility tools that are built into Zoom, and there's more that are coming. So right now, Zoom automatically provides, or you can have it automatically provide a transcript, which I think we've enabled for anybody anyway, or for everybody anyway, rather. So it automatically does a text-to-speak generation of your content. Coming soon, we were hoping to have this back in September, but with the great increase of utilization of Zoom during the time of COVID here, they had to dedicate all of their resources that they had set aside for this just to kind of maintain stability. But what they had done in September is they set up a new server farm to do automatic live transcriptioning. So in a Zoom session, I can have the transcription available automatically right live with what I'm speaking, which is really cool. It is available now for their business partners, but they're not going to enable it for the EDUs until probably later in January, is last I heard. So that'll be something else that after that's available too, you can go in and edit that transcript. But the really nice thing about Zoom is that because it keeps track of speakers, it does a really great job of saying who's speaking now versus other people. So when there's crosstalk, it does a much better job of accurately transcribing that. So they're kind of separate things that happen in Zoom that can maintain that accessibility. Okay, so now that we know what it does check versus what it doesn't check, let's kind of dig into what it does check and what we can do to address common issues here. So this area of Ally is called the Instructor Feedback. And so what it does is it provides obviously feedback to faculty about the accessibility of their course content. And it's done pretty easy to use a score gauge. And we'll take a look at that again here in just a second. When you click on that gauge for a piece of content, then it gives you more in-depth description of what the issues are with that document, and more importantly, gives you guidance on how to remediate those issues here. So we'll take a look at that. So again, just going back to that bad document here, if you highlight over that gauge here, again, only instructors see this. Students don't see this. Everybody sees the alternative formats icon, but only instructors will see this accessibility gauge here. So again, visually right away, red bad, right? So we kind of ingrained to know that here, unless you're colorblind, then that's another issue. But one of the things that Blackboard Ally does is it does use alternative text to show, hey, red versus green colorblindness is a problem. So we make that available to students that can't see that. And it's got a little indicator on there too, so we can visually still see that in not just necessarily using a color reference here. So, and so what do those gauges mean? Well, here's what it looks like here. So anything that's in the red and it's kind of pointing towards 10 o'clock there means that there's some significant issues with the document and those need to be addressed. Now, most likely those are pretty easy to remedy. And so it's pretty straightforward on how to deal with those. So it's kind of like the documents that are going to more greatly impact your score usually have issues that are really easy to fix. But if you're going for that perfection, it can be a little bit more harder to address those particular issues here. So that's kind of what those all mean. I won't read through them all, but I think they make pretty good sense here as well. But you can kind of get a feel for what all those look like here. And you can see the icon's a little bit different in D2L versus what Blackboard uses here in all their other learning management systems. I'm not sure why, but that's what it looks like there versus what they have here. But the color scheme still matches as well. So when you click on that little gauge, then you're brought into this instructor feedback screen here. So it brings up your document. So this is that bad document that I have linked to my course, and talks about what are the major issues with this course. Well, for this piece of content. So for this particular issue, this piece of content, excuse me, there are two primary issues with this. One, I don't have alternate text for my images. So again, as a student is using a screen reader to see this, hey, we all know that's a picture of the Beatles here, but that's just to a screen reader, it says, here's an image. Doesn't give any context, doesn't know what's in that image. But if I simply add an alt text and say, hey, here's George and John, Ringo, and everybody else, then that gives me a little bit more context for that image. And so even though I can't necessarily see that image, I'm going to know what that image contains. So that may seem like a very obvious thing, but it also, for various different learning disorders, can have an impact on, for example, some people have difficulty interpreting graphs. And I've seen a lot of content where the instructor will just post a picture of a graph, but will not describe what's going on in the graph. And so that's an accessibility issue as well. So we'll talk about not only just talking about what the name of the image is, but what's happening in the image, giving a description of what's going on in there. So that's kind of the things that we have to look for here. Now, Ally is not quite smart enough to discern that. So it doesn't say, oh, you have a bar chart. You better describe what each one of these bars mean and what quantity it is and how that data interoperates and relates to each other. No, that's going to be something that you'll have to kind of assign to that. It's just going to say, hey, you have a description. You might just say bar chart. And it's going to say, good, you're accessible. Well, it's not really accessible. So those are things we have to work on as well. The other thing is, it looks like, visually when I see this document, I have a hierarchy. I have like a history heading and I have formation and early years heading, but I actually haven't used the heading features inside of Word. And so as a screen reader is looking through this, the history, the formation and early years is just given the exact same weight as any other text in here. So as I read through that, it doesn't know what that hierarchy is. So that's why it's important to use the headings within Word in order to make sure that that document hierarchy gets translated over so that if I am using a screen reader, I can, it's going to say, okay, now we're in the history section. Would you like to skip to the formation section? And I can do that as well. It helps me navigate that as well when I'm using a screen reader or other assistive technology. And so fortunately, those are really easy things to fix. And just by adding the alt text and by making those headers available inside of there, that's probably going to adjust my score northward of 80%. And so I'm going to have a significant increase in the score there. So let's take a look at that here. So let me pop into my course here. So we'll find that bad document here again. So I'm going to click on that accessibility score. So there you go. There's my issue here. So it says here, 3 issues, images without descriptions. So I've got 3 issues in here, and that's kind of the issue there. So just by addressing those, I'm going to make a lot of, I'm going to increase my score significantly. So how do I do that? Well, I download the original document. So let me do that here really quick. Oops, let me get out of here. I'm going to download that document really quick here because I actually downloaded it at home last night. So. I probably should have done this ahead of time. I was going to add some quick alt text. You can't see me doing this, but I'm going to insert some captions here. For some reason, it's not letting me add alt text. Well, I'll have to do that later here. So next time I do this session, I'll make sure I have that alt text in there already. But what I would basically do then is I'd go through that workflow. I'd make those fixes that it says I need to do. And then yes, if you noticed, I might click on here. I can do it from here too. There's a way to automatically just immediately upload that document. So if I've made those fixes and I want to go through and replace that, I don't have to go through D2L's interface to do that. I can just drag and drop it right there. It's going to re-upload it into the course for me, automatically address it, and then it's going to rescore that. And so if I were able to fix those alt tags, which I'm not able to do for some reason on my Mac right now, it would probably jump my score probably to 70 or 80% just by doing that. And so then I could say, okay, I've addressed that issue. Well, what's the next issue I have here? Well, let me click on this and I can see, okay, here are all the issues. Yeah, so there it says it increased my score to 53%. I was being overly ambitious with my rating here. So now it says, okay, the document does not have headings. Okay, what does that mean? So I can see that, okay, document doesn't have headings. Okay, I don't know what that means. So I click on here and it says, heading isn't always a heading. So do not use visual appearances such as text size, bold, or underline, which are all the things that have happened in this document. It says use the program's native heading styles to ensure that headings are properly marked. And let's see if I can do that at least in here. Oh, I see why it's doing it. It's in compatibility mode, so it's being dumb. So it's, yeah. I'll save a Word document version of that. I can do that too. So by doing those 2 things, then I'm going to be able to immediately address the accessibility of that document, and it's going to score that significantly higher than what it is. So and I can go through all this and say, okay, why do these things? What's the rationale behind doing all of this? So it's not just saying, okay, headings bad or lack of headings are bad, fix them. It's telling you why it's an issue and what are different ways that you can use to address this. Okay, so next, how do I do this again? Okay, I'm convinced I need to have headings. How do I do this? Well, it says, okay, well, locate or download your original document. So I can download that right here, open it in your software, and then it kind of goes through the process there of going through there. And I can click on help and things like that too. So it kind of takes you through the basic steps of remediation. Now, again, we have much more detailed steps on how to remediate these common issues in our digital accessibility training shell. Everybody who is teaching this upcoming semester here should be in that shell and should be able to access that. But we can kind of walk you through that if you have any questions about that. But that's basically how the process works here. So let me pop back here. So just to recap all of that, so what does it provide in terms of instructor feedback? How does it identify issues in my course and more importantly, help me remediate those issues? Well, it provides an accessibility score, so I can immediately have a visual reference of what content has significant issues, what are just some minor issues, and I can kind of prioritize them that way. It provides descriptions of those issues and more importantly, guidance on how to remediate those. And allows instructors to immediately upload the remediated files, which then are reassessed and rescored. So it's trying to encourage you to address the issues right away by making it as easy as possible to do so. So giving you that guidance, giving you a way to immediately re-upload that content, and then it tries to immediately rescore that. I think it takes a few minutes to do that. So don't be surprised, especially during startup, if it takes like 10 minutes to regenerate that score. So, but it basically is trying to gamify the accessibility experience here a little bit. So that's how you can deal with it from the individual content perspective. But I think what some of you might prefer to do is to take a look at the overall accessibility of your course. And Blackboard Ally provides a way to do that through the course report here. So come January 4th, you will see a new menu item under resources in D2L. It'll say this basically Ally course report. And you can click on that, and it gives you a really nice dashboard. It gives you an overall score. It lists the accessibility issues in your course, and it gives you a couple of options. It says, well, here are the issues that will have the greatest impact on your overall score. You want to fix those. Or recognizing that you're in a time crunch, it might say, well, here are some that are really easy to fix that will have some impact on your score. So you can kind of determine which way you would like to achieve that, which way you would like to tackle all of that. It also gives you a list of all the file types in your course, as well as an inventory of those files and any accessibility issues for that. So let's take a look at that. So one thing you'll notice, like I said, in my course, let me get back to my content area here. Again, I have a lot of external links. This is probably not the greatest example, but this is kind of what it would look like in my course. So it might take me a long time to find content that Ally has checked and try to remedy it that way. So again, one of the easier ways to do that might be to take a look at the dashboard here. So if I click on that link there, I did it kind of quickly. Let me show you that again here. So I go to resources on my nav bar. And again, this will be available on January 4th. It's not available yet, but it will be there on January 4th. I have that Ally course report. And when I click on that, it opens this window. So it shows my course, and then it gives me those options here. Okay, so here's the content with the easiest issues to fix. Maybe I'm just starting to learn how to do this. I don't have a really good grasp on content remediation, so I just kind of want to get my feet wet. So maybe I'll start with that one. So let's go there and say, okay, well, that bad document is kind of the culprit here. So if I click on that, it says these are pretty easy issues to fix. And I would agree. Adding alt text to your images, changing headers is pretty straightforward to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. And then I can just immediately upload that. Okay, so that's great. Well, what about some of those harder issues here? So let's take a look at that. Well, one of the things I have in my course, it's an optional resource, is a PDF here. And it's not tagged. What does that mean? Well, tagging is a hierarchy that it does. It's a meta hierarchy inside of a document that provides guidance for screen readers and for tab order. And so as the screen reader is reading through this, it will kind of give it some guidance as to what content is what. It's kind of like the headers in a Word document. So like heading 1 is the top level, heading 2 is the next level behind that, and things like that. That's kind of what tagging does. It does more things than that too, but that's kind of a base level. Well, you can see this is more of an infographic than it is a document. So it's really a great resource, but in terms of the accessibility of the content, not really that great. It's got music notes in there. So if a screen reader is reading through that, it's gonna be like, what on earth is this? So it's not gonna know anything like that. So adding that tagging will tell the screen reader, oh, these are musical notes, and these are what the musical notes do. So that's kind of what it says. So this is a dotted quarter note. This is equal to a quarter note plus an eighth note, things like that. So those are going to be all part of that tagging process. So you can imagine, for a lot of documents, tagging is pretty simple. For a document like this, tagging is going to be very complicated because there's a whole concept of music notation in here and things like that that will make it a little bit more difficult. So for that reason, that's kind of the more difficult fixes to do, because it doesn't necessarily always understand the context. So it just says, oh, well, this PDF doesn't have tagging. So that could be a pretty simple fix if it's just a simple document, or it could be a very involved fix. Now, what I will say is that most of our PDFs are coming from source documents. Now, if you're scanning a book or things like that, that's one thing. But if you're taking a Word document and making it a PDF to make it available to your students, well, A, that's not really necessary anymore. But B, if you go back to that Word document, make it accessible, and then save it as a PDF, that's going to bring all that tagging information over. So you don't have to go through that PDF and deal with it that way. So if possible, kind of circumvent trying to tag a PDF if you can get back to the original document to address them that way. And then again, most cases, that's some sort of Word document or some sort of graphics format. If you're using InDesign or something like that, you can build those accessibility things into that source document and then not have to worry about the outputted PDF, because it's going to maintain that accessible tagging and header information from that. So again, From my perspective, it looks like my course is sitting pretty well. But again, as I shared with you, Ally's not checking the external links or doing anything like that too. So I have a whole host of other information and other issues that I'll have to address on my own. But Ally does try to help me with at least the stuff that's inside of D2L so that we can start tackling that. And then I just have screenshots of that just so you can see what that looks like. So come January 4th, that's what it's going to look like. So I ran a little bit over time, but I am happy to stick around and answer any questions that you might have. If you have to get to your next session, which I'm going to hopefully most of you don't have that since we're done with the semester, feel free to sign off, and just feel free if you have any questions after you exit out, you're thinking about this as it gets enabled in your course, you have questions about it, go ahead and just email ctl@usd.edu and we can help you out with any of those. But again, I'm happy to field any questions if you want to just hop on your mics and ask, or if you just want to put them in the chat window, I'll be happy to address those. Who can help create headings in Word that maintain current formatting? Scott, that's something you can actually do pretty easily if you highlight. So if you've got the current formatting all set up and ready to go, what you can do is you can highlight it inside of Word, and then you can apply the style to the heading. So it's kind of backwards. So in Word, you can do one of two things with styles. You can either highlight it and apply the style that's predefined for that heading, or you can do the opposite of it. You can just highlight this as, I want the heading 1 to match this. And then it's going to kind of make sure that that does that. And then you can kind of retroactively, once you've changed that, you'll still have to change everything into that heading, because it's not going to be smart enough to know, okay, well, every font and style that looks like this, I'm going to turn into heading 1. But at least it won't change the formatting then on that. Does that make sense? And there's guidance in the online faculty, or excuse me, not the online faculty orientation, but the digital accessibility training to do that as well. Yeah, so like what Mandy said, there's a, once you set a, you can actually say, oh, go through all the effort to set up the heading, even though you've not necessarily tagged it as a heading to make it look like that, but then you can highlight it and apply that to a heading. So I say, this is what I want heading 1 to look like. And so once you've done that, then you just have to still kind of manually go through and highlight that to change that in heading 1, but it's not going to mess with your formatting thereafter. To some extent, we're still kind of working through how we're going to help with remediation. We certainly have tech fellows that can kind of walk you through the steps to do that, but we're not necessarily having tech fellow resources to do the steps right now. Now, certain areas do have tech fellows assigned to help with those types of things, but from a university perspective, that's still something that we're trying to suss out, especially from a more broad perspective of accessibility. Is like, well, who can help us out with like fixing video transcriptions and things like that? So those are still discussions that are happening at Executive Council, and I've not heard much back from that yet. So things like dealing with, well, who's going to pay for our transcriptionist? Who's going to pay for our we need an ASL interpreter? Who's going to pay for that, and things like that. We're still kind of working through those types of things as well. Yeah, we're hoping that some of this is going to be pretty. I don't want to say it's easy to do necessarily. The first couple times you do it, it'll be a little bit challenging to some extent, but hopefully once you get the hang of it, it's going to be something that we can have everybody attack it by little bits, and then we can tackle some of the bigger issues more centrally. Like a very common issue we have is PDF remediation. A lot of scanned chapters, a lot of untagged PDFs, which are kind of hard to do. So we'll try to work with people like, well, do you have the source of that? So can we go back to that Word document that generated that PDF? Well, let's make that Word document accessible, because then once you save that as a PDF, all that accessibility will come forward with that as well. So those are kind of things that we're dealing with there. Other questions or comments? I'm going to turn off the recording now. So